Okay, I think we're ready to get started now with the Takes Action Session 1. We're pleased to have Dean Rob Wright from University of Toronto and Dean Keith Krumwiede from California College of the Arts to welcome us. I'll pass the mic over to them.
Hello and welcome to the first event of the Daniels Faculty 2020-21 Talks and Lecture Series, which is titled Resolution and Agencies. My name is Rob Wright, and I am the Dean of the Daniels Faculty at the University of Toronto. We are very delighted to launch our series with this cross-coastal and international collaboration with the California College of the Arts. First, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I also want to state personally that I support sovereignty over unceded lands, Indigenous lands, and I support their objectives of nation-to-nation status within Canada. And with that, I want to welcome Keith Krumwiede, Dean of the CCA, and our collaborator on this three-part event. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome everyone. This event also marks the start of our lecture series for fall 2020 titled Remaking, which includes a variety of online events from book launches to panel discussions to lectures to dialogues. You can learn more about our programs by visiting our new content channel at scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. It's also customary at CCA to acknowledge the land on which we operate. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. Now to your hosts, Niraj Bhatia and Mason White.
I think we just need Niraj unmuted. Nini.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Rob. My name is Niraj Bhatia. I'm an associate professor at CCA and founder of the design practice, The Open Workshop. Thank you all for coming today to the virtual launch and first session and conversation around Bracket Takes Action. I'll be hosting alongside with the co-editor Mason White, professor at the University of Toronto and partner of Lateral Office. Before digging in, we wanted to thank the California College of the Arts, the Daniels faculty at the University of Toronto, and AR&D Publishing for co-sponsoring this event. In particular, thank you to Keith, Rob, and Gordon Goff for their support of this project. Thank you as well to the Graham Foundation, who has been a consistent supporter of the Bracket project since its inception. Thank you to our media partner, Archinect, as well as Haller Brun, the graphic designers of this issue. A big thank you to all the contributors for sharing their inspiring work, and we have a few of these contributors here today to share their work with us. And last but not least, thank you to the amazing Daniels and CCA team in the background, Nini, Sarah, Aiden, and Hannah.
Each issue of Bracket addresses an urgent contemporary theme on architecture, environment, and digital culture. This fourth issue addresses the notion of action in spatial practice and the complex interplay between politics, society, and space. Hannah Arendt's 1958 treatise, The Human Condition, cites action as one of the three tenets, along with labor and work, of the vita active, or active life. Action, she writes, is a necessary catalyst for, quote, the human condition of plurality, end quote, which is an expression of the common public and distinct individual. However, more than 50 years later, we appear in a multitude of ways. Therefore, the role of spatial practice in relation to forms of action also needs to be re-examined. Spatial practice's role in anticipating, resisting, organizing, or absorbing action has been broadly challenged by shifts in notions of publicness, spatial practices, and roles of government. how and where to act is increasingly complex as it requires new techniques and assemblies to reflect the tendencies of distinct factions and other associated values.
So Takes Action emerged from conversations between Mason and I going all the way back to 2016, and at the time reacting to events such as the Arab Spring, to Occupy Wall Street, to the Umbrella Movement. These were forms of action that used the space of the city as a theater for assembly. Fast forward to today in 2020, we are presented with an ever wider range of conditions to design and respond to action. We wanted this issue to probe all the different ways that action was emerging and ask how design might incite socio-political action. These forms of action span from the domestic realm to public space, from online to offline, from confrontation to subtle recalibrations.
This collection is structured into 6 sub-themes: reaction, counteraction, interaction, faction, inaction, and retroaction. These themes reveal the diversity of issues, methods, and most importantly, the relevancy of the topic to designers and design thinkers. This first session, as one of 3, includes 2 of the topics. The first one here, reaction, consists of bold statements and projects that are reactionary in nature. This refers to reconceptualizing everyday elements of life, such as the suburban home or speculative office tower, to the challenging negotiation within agonistic pluralism. What can design do when it is entitled to simply react? Today, we're fortunate that reaction is represented by Kees Lockman and Christopher Roach. Kees Lockman is assistant professor and chair of landscape architecture at University of British Columbia. Chris Roach is a senior adjunct professor at CCA and a principal at Studio Vara in San Francisco.
So CounterAction, the other theme we'll be discussing today, offers unique and alternative sites for action at various scales. These include playful surfaces, hidden kitchens, refugee camps, and the new demands of the civic square. How can the overlooked sites of appearance in our contemporary commons promote alternative forms of action? And we're super lucky today and grateful to have Lindsey Harkema and Azadeh Zlafarani presenting their articles in the book. Azadeh Zlafarani is a PhD candidate at the Bartlett School of Architecture and founder of Platform 28 for Art and Architecture in Tehran. Lindsey Harkema is a New York City-based architect, educator, and founder of the collaborative WIP, Work in Progress, Women in Practice. She teaches at the Spitzer School of Architecture and the City College of New York and Bernard College as well. And I believe Lindsey just was awarded a competition win today. So congratulations, Lindsey.
To launch the book series, doing an online book launch and online these 3 sessions, during the duration of them, AR&D Publishers has agreed to offer a generous discount, 30% off for US, Canada, and abroad. There's specific codes which you can see here on the screen, and I believe we're posting that into the chat where you will be able to find it there. Also, I think we're going to email it around as well. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom there, which is a good place to post. Okay, I think we are ready to get started. And Kees is our first presenter.
All right, thank you and welcome everyone. Thank you, Niraj and Mason. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Is everything okay? Maybe someone can put a thumbs up. Yeah, Niraj is putting a thumbs up.
Great.
Okay. So I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Kitsilano, Vancouver, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, in particular the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. As a guest to this land, I'm very thankful and I consider it a privilege to be able to live, work, and learn here. For those of you that have been lucky enough to already have a copy of the book, my essay discusses the emergence of design activism in the last decades. I introduce Chantal Mouffe's notion of agonistic pluralism, to provide a critical lens through which we can examine the framework of design activism in order to inform projects and platforms that not only aspire to politicize social and environmental issues, but also give rise to new processes and spatial configurations that contest existing systems, powers, and authorities. Over the next 7 minutes, I will provide some context to the conceptual frameworks discussed in the article, briefly highlight one of the 3 examples that I've shown in the book, and conclude by posing some questions for all of us to ponder and think about. I will start by contextualizing design, both as a medium and process. Here I borrow from Carl de Salvio, who highlights 3 intrinsic aspects of design. Firstly, the practice of design extends to professions of design, meaning the processes and physical interventions created through design influence and engage a wide variety of audiences and actors. All these constituents should be taken into consideration by those practicing design. The practice of design makes ideas, beliefs, and capacities for action experientially accessible, visible, and known. In contrast to written and spoken words, design is visual, often physical and experiential, thereby accessible to different audiences and cultures, as well as leaving a lasting imprint in social and physical fabrics. And finally, the practice of design is normative. Design aims to produce new conditions by which to understand and act on current conditions, as well as to speculate on future conditions. As such, designers and processes and the objects they produce should be embedded with ethical, moral, and political critiques in order to make situations better. In his article, Design Activism for Whom, Randy Hester eloquently states that every act of city making, landscape architecture, environmental planning, and architecture is a creative act, a direct action to achieve an end, the very definition of activism. However, Hester also emphasizes that not every design or designer consciously uses activism or the agency of design to challenge and confront entrenched sociopolitical powers. I recommend everyone to read this very short article. He makes a distinction between 5 types of designers: the blissfully naive, the savvy naive, servants, contextualist, and catalyst, of which he argues only the last grouping, the catalyst, fully commit to operating outside the realm of polite politics. So how then can we make sure that design as a form of activism engages the political realm? Here, then, it's useful to introduce Chantal Mouffe's concept of agonistic pluralism. Mouffe argues that rather than aiming for consensus, democracy should be based on facilitating and enabling dynamic disputes and struggles amongst groups and individuals with competing values and beliefs. She emphasizes that agonism emphasizes permanent conflict and creates spaces of contestation that do not specifically aim for reconciliation and unified expression. The challenge here is that design has a tendency to fix space, foreclosing open-endedness and eliminating chance. It therefore becomes important to design processes and places that enable different actors and constituents to intervene. In doing so, design can become a form of resistance, a vehicle to mobilize and empower marginalized social and political voices. So in the article, I discuss 3 examples of spatial practices, each of which uses agonistic approaches to questions and that change hegemonic practices, systems, or authorities. These projects are listed here. The IC project by the Institute for Applied Autonomy, Vacant NL by Rietveld Architecture, Art and Affordances, and the Blue House, the Blue House by Jean van Heijswijk. In the interest of time, I only have time to highlight Het Blauwe Huis by Jean van Heijswijk. I found this quote from her from a recent publication that speaks to, I think, the challenges that we have as designers in communicating what we do and how we connect with the audiences we engage. She says, in a lot of places where I work, people feel left out of the way the spaces are formed, shaped, governed, and financed. They no longer understand why the spaces they live and work in look the way they do. Het Blauwe Huis then confronts the ways in which contemporary urban design practices fail to engage citizens in design processes, as well as a lack of design spaces for cultural expression and open-ended activities. The project transformed a detached single-family house into a temporary physical space for various resident-run public functions and activities that were not provided in the formative years of the suburb Eiburg in Amsterdam. So she, saw this lack of space given for these cultural practices, and for a 4-year-long period of time, this house became a place for residents and artists to create spaces, from bakeries to flower shops to open discussion spaces. This then informed the overall master planning and ongoing formation of Eiburg moving forward. By describing and simultaneously intervening in the everyday life in the area, Het Blauwe Huis facilitated the acceleration and intensification of cultural processes in their neighborhood, allowing for lasting transformations of urban processes and social relationships on different scales. As suggested by Melanie Dodd, the emphasis on practice rather than a singular object of a building fundamentally reorients our terms and acknowledges that spatial practice does not assume privilege, and it doesn't privilege the social actions or processes over the material, but rather allows them all to be understood as a critical set of agencies, producing and affecting actions and consequences. Het Blauwe Huis and the other examples in the essay are by no means a comprehensive account of what methods and modes of design activism are currently being deployed. And I encourage all of you to think about spatial practices you think explicitly engage the political realm, as well as the tools, mechanisms, and processes that are being leveraged to contest current paradigms. I also think spatial practices have to fundamentally engage a range of difficult questions that often currently are not being thought of. And I just put these three on the slide. Which value systems and perspectives are being incorporated in design and decision making? Whose future visions are prioritized and whose are denied legitimacy? And whose bodies, livelihood, and homes are regarded as collateral to implement designs? Having these questions guide our design processes and outcomes will ensure we escape the realm of what Hester called polite politics in order to truly engage the political realm of design. With that, I'll close my portion of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kees. I believe Chris Roach, you're up next.
Hi, can you hear me? Great. Let me share my screen here. Bear with me. All right, can anybody see that? Okay. Thank you, Mason and Niraj, for inviting me to participate in the publication and in this event. Thanks, Kees, for kicking us off. So in 2008, Mirko Zardini and Giovanna Barassi produced a milestone exhibition at what we call here the other CCA, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, called Actions, What Can You Do with the City? And they published an eponymous book that presented a cross-section of the alternative spatial practices that had at that time emerged from the groundswell of so-called guerrilla urbanism, which blossomed exponentially around the time of the last great global recession. In response to that crisis, architects and urban theorists were positing various forms of direct action as alternatives to the perceived ideological dead ends of theory and practice. And there was a lot of energy and interest devoted to these explorations that coalesced into a de facto grassroots movement that received widespread attention, both popular culture, through the internet and social media, as well as within more traditional academic forms of lectures, exhibitions, and publications, leading up to actions, the publication and exhibition itself. Today, like in 2008, or even perhaps more, there is an urgency to address the triple threat of acute economic, ecological, and equity crises that are occurring simultaneously in our society, both locally and globally, under the shadow of COVID-19, systemic racism, and environmental collapse. Once again, architects are searching for a way to take meaningful action, and there is an intense discourse around what the agency of architecture is and how we can intervene. However, unlike that time, the conditions of the global pandemic have made some of the traditional forms of civic action simultaneously more dangerous and, in that way, more radical. But in general, these conditions have constrained the kind of design activism in the public realm that we saw in the previous decade. Architects are generally not out in the streets building ad hoc playgrounds or participating in collective events like guerrilla gardening. However, some of the experimental actions and interventions from that time are making echoes in the kinds of emergency responses to the pandemic and overnight transformation of the urban environment under quarantine, such as the repurposing of private spaces for essential services, the reclaiming of public space for socially distanced activities, etc. The other key differences in this time around are that the pandemic has fewer boundaries, either state, socioeconomic, or other. And the scale and swiftness of changes that we've had to make as a species to survive have demonstrated that large-scale and drastic action can be taken quickly if there's political will and clear necessity. Arguably, those changes have been most effective when they are equally top-down and bottom-up, when popular support and adoption of practices are reinforced and scaled through state policy. Things like quarantines, mask wearing, testing and contact tracing. This is the crux of my critique of actions, the book, and action in architectural practice. The critical connection between top-down and bottom-up, or the tactical and the strategic, as some might call it, is necessary to address the scale of the crises we face, the structures and systems that must be dismantled and rebuilt, and the questions of disciplinarity and agency that architects must confront to maintain relevance and act effectively to bring about much needed change. My essay in bracket is essentially a book review of Zardini and Barassi's actions, but leverages that format to launch an interrogation of action and activist design practices writ large. Here I must pause to say that I'm both fascinated by and greatly admire many of these practices, and have myself participated and collaborated with groups like Rebar on similar activist design projects. I also deeply value the importance in civic action and participation in public to give voice to the suppressed and resist tyranny and systemic racism. But my belief in civic action, participation in design activism, and genuine curiosity brought these deeper questions and concerns to light. And thus my critique should be seen as an investigation into the instrumentality of these practices in the interest of expanding and enriching architecture practice itself. I'll summarize these questions briefly and some thoughts that might prompt responses and discussions with my colleagues here on the panel. So my first question is the challenge of scale. This is a question that the mini movement that coalesced around guerrilla urbanism, in my mind, failed to adequately address. The vivid examples of crowdsourced urbanism are all too often taken at face value as being inherently good and not critically assessed for their potential to address the enormity and seriousness of the urban challenges we face. Like the proponents of everyday urbanism, its proponents focus on finding alternative meanings and interpretations of the city and might avoid any deep responsibility for how the shaping of physical space can engage the forces of urbanization at an adequate scale. How can this everyday urbanism operating in the fine grain of the public realm ever add up to more than the sum of its parts and truly improve the global urban condition. My second question is how actions can affect change on the structures and systems that underlie our built environment. In Actions, Barassi's own essay concludes in a kind of anti-manifesto. She says, "What all these ideas offer is a parallel system. They make no claim to represent a new world that could arrogantly replace the one now in our cities. They do not constitute a unison response, but offer everybody a system of possible alternatives." While all this potential is quite enticing, it relies on a kind of faith in the ability of activities in the life world to recode the city and resist the system. Yet it's not quite clear how these changes in meaning at the level of the everyday can allow us to develop concepts that are necessary for developing a new framework for design practice. My final line of critique is around the questions of disciplinarity and the agency of architecture. While the actions that the book details offer some compelling suggestions, it's not clear that they provide us with a tangible set of strategies within the material practice of architecture. I argue that we must not confuse civic action with design activity or civic agency with design agency. Thus, I might conclude by stating my reaction to action is maybe not more action, but something like pro-action. If we're all out acting and not thinking, drawing, and planning, haven't we potentially lost touch with what it means to be architects and urban designers? Perhaps what differentiates our particular form of agency from the protester or politician is that the act of design is by necessity both distance from its subject through abstraction and representation, and proactive in its organization and shaping of material processes, rather than reactive to the diffuse and fragmentary forces shaping the city. Instead, we must constantly work to connect action to planning and channel the energy and will for immediate change into long-range plans and large-scale strategies that can address the fundamental dysfunctions and disparities of our cities. As Fritz Haig says in his essay, In Actions, between the utopian fantasy of starting over and the impossibility of continuing in the direction that we are headed, there lies a middle ground in which we come to terms with the urban decisions that have already been made and repurpose aspects of our existing built-in environment in strategic ways. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Next is Azadeh.
Thank you so much, Mason and Niraj. Can you hear me? Yes, well, and hello to everybody attending this session. The title of this paper was borrowed from an article written by Christopher Hitchens in Vanity Fair in 2005, when he was reporting his trip to Iran. In this article, he refers to Iranian society as an as-if society where people live as if they are free, as if they are in the West, as if they have the right to an opinion or even a private life. Years later, I came across an article by Mark Lee in San Rocco magazine where he drew a comparative analysis between O.M. Unger's proposal, Berlin, a Green Archipelago, and John Haydock's memorial proposal, Victims, to speak of a city island approach to urban design for Berlin as a city, a post-war city facing a vast wartime destruction and depopulation. Unger's archaeological approach to urban decay and Haydock's emphasis on collective memory and personified narratives resembled a familiar scenario that I could see in the city that I spent nearly half of my life in. A shrinking city due to sudden changes in immigration rates, a city with solidified borders, not from rigid and physical walls, but from introduction of sanctions and embargoes, a city where built forms stand still and open spaces convert into dollars to make up for financial loss of an in-debt government. It reminded me of a public realm that has lost its identity and citizens in search of alternatives for public presence. Since 1800, Tehran has grown from a small town with population of 50,000 to one of the largest cities in the world, with over 50 million inhabitants in recent years. Iran's integration with the global economy has happened through commodification of agriculture and establishment of oil industry, making it a bridge between the country and the rest of the world. Eventually, under the name of modernization and in favor of the capitalist system, the built environment of the city should have transformed itself to a system that benefited economic agendas. And this is how the 1- or 2-story inward-looking courtyard buildings lost the ground in favor of a higher, extroverted form of construction. The change in building form has been largely associated with the change in the street system and consequently the social structure of the city. By taking away the courtyards from the built environment, obviously the balance between public and private life was distorted. This new city required new public spaces, and this need was answered by the introduction of entertainment and leisure activities, spaces, and in later years, zones and districts. Victor Gruen's master planning of Tehran in late 60s is a good example of the way the socio-economic structure of the city was envisioned to speak of a symbiosis among commerce and community, a vision that was central to Gruen's vision or grander vision when he first introduced shopping malls in America. Cinemas are early and persistent modern examples of such spaces that replace the traditional performative qualities of open public courts. Well, these spaces became also the heart of anti-Western movements in late 1970s and even managed to spark the uprisings leading to the 1979 revolution. Many of these spaces were out of use. They were either subject to the new regime's agenda against privatization or Islamic legislations, or their owners simply fled the country after the revolution. However, they continued to stay as giant spatial elements in Iranians' collective memory. While the modern planning of Tehran killed courtyard social gatherings, it redefined a new public realm that promoted consumerist culture within it. And while the 1979 revolution tried to wipe out the so-called Western impositions by shutdowns or destructions or conversions, the disappearance of these alternative public realms gave birth to a new tactical approach. In this tactical approach, people recreated a new public realm within the private domain and away from the regulated outer world. In our discipline, or better said, design discipline, we often refer to this phenomena as interior urbanism. Only in this scenario, it is quite played down, sort of informal and bottom-up version of it. In this hidden public realm, homes with their rooms, with their roofs, with their basements, shopping centers, public transport systems, ski slopes, restaurants, and cafes turn into heterotopias that give people agency in defining their public presence as per their liking. My contribution to Bracket was a background study for a design proposal for master planning of a shopping mall in Tehran. At the time, my thoughts were heavily influenced by the rapid wave of commercial developments in Iran under the influence of neighboring countries such as UAE or Turkey, and in relationship to a promising political horizon as the outcome of the nuclear negotiations between Iran and the West. The rise of shopping malls and the downfall of cultural entities and civic involvements were troubling facts in urban restructuring of Tehran, as if the two were in constant battle, as if one was the enemy and the other the victim. As explained earlier, urban decays, collective memories, critical everyday life, and the comeback of shopping malls as drivers for my proposal. Influenced by Michel Ducerto's take on strategies and tactics and Carl Schmitt's definition of enemy, my proposal formulated a pure commercial space that was permeated by contradictory camouflage cultural activities taking place within them. Unger's take on urban reuse translated itself to abandoned modernist cinemas of La Lazare Street in core downtown of Tehran, and Haydock's interest in personified spaces and their narratives revealed itself in series of structures that engage with users and their collective memories. The proposal was based on an assumption that a mall can be a combination of segregated enclaves such as a supermarket, a food court, retail spaces, playgrounds, parkings, and offices, and they can connect to each other through an urban path. The proposal envisioned La Lazare, a street full of decaying and abandoned modernist cinemas in Tehran, as interior urban squares lurking within the voids of each cinema. At the time, the Green Movement of Iran, the Arab Spring, Tahrir, or Azadeh Square, and the importance of public space in political uprisings were the focus of architectural debates, and in my mind, I was after an interiorized space of resistance that borrowed operational tactics from everyday lives. Well, this pursuit was realized with the help of furniture design and the ability of furniture's changing from a commercial program to a cultural program and vice versa within these individual buildings. As a result, for an urban design proposal, an IKEA-like booklet of instructions was formulated for numerous furniture arrangements for cataloged with assembly instructions and details. The proposal, The proposal was trying to reduce the scale of an urban project to the small dimension of furniture, to speak of flexibility, to speak of malleability, to speak of change and adaptation, and also to speak of authority of users within the rigidity of a built form. A process I would refer to as object urbanism. In this scenario, a hostel turns to a cinema, a food court to a library, a parking to a gallery, a playground to a digital publishing house, a shop to an audio library, a supermarket to a theater or virtual galleries, and an office to an exhibition space. To conclude, I would like to refer to a paragraph within the paper I wrote for Bracket, where it says, while derived from Unger's initial idea of an urban archipelago, Haydock extended the concept as a system that can translate itself to an experiencing economy in the physical world. In the same world, the urbanist of the future is an urban designer come imaginer, melding usage and experience through a Machiavellian approach to given resources. If historical buildings were the starting point for Unger's, for a future urbanist, commerce and commercial built forms could be a substitute. In his book, Possibilities of an Absolute Architecture, Pier Vittorio Aureli refers to Carl Schmitt's definition of an enemy to be the recognition of one's opposite that is instrumental to avoiding self-deception. For him, the figure of a friend is always in the background. A friend, by virtue of his benevolence, can only confirm our situation of self-deception, writes Aureli. The enemy, on the other hand, strangers us from our familiar self-perception and gives us back the sharp contour of our own position. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Azadeh. It's a great project, and we'll pass it on to Lindsey before we jump into discussion. If there's any questions occurring to anyone in the audience, feel free to start writing them into the Q&A box. Over to you, Lindsey.
Okay, thank you, Niraj and Mason. Does that look good? Do you see presentation? Okay, yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this discussion and part of the publication. My article, The Private Space of Collective Resistance, is a summary of research that was conducted at the Strelka Institute in Moscow from 2012 to 2013. But I'll begin with a quote from another recent publication by Nandini Bagshi called Counterinstitution, about the activist estates of the Lower East Side in New York City. Buildings are not simply elements of an inert backdrop in front of which important events unfold. They are an active component of the practices of the groups they support. They move from being merely convenient to being crucial to the social movements they house. Space is not simply there for the taking, but is produced through conscious participation and embodied action. An act of protest is a rejection of a perceived and unwanted future. Throughout history, forms of protest have been significant agents of social and political change, from underground countercultural movements to the most public and publicized demonstrations and revolutions. Russia's history of protest is a testament to underground opposition, from the secret societies which fostered the opposition that led to the 1917 revolution, to dissident kitchen talks during the Soviet Union, and art and literary movements that occupied private spaces in avoidance of state censorship in the 1980s and 90s. What is a space of protest? Our first thought is typically of a mass demonstration in a public square. We equate the power of the action with the scale of its demonstration, or its influence with its publicness. What is less obvious is the importance of dissent circulated in the private realm. This undercurrent of opposition has significant impact on society and its progress, and is essential and perhaps more critical than the public outburst. Private forms of protest inhabit the backstages of our physical, social, and political environments and shape new ideas about how they should be formed. The 1905 Moscow Uprising erupted out of the collective dissent that had been flourishing in the underground. Organized within factories, the growing insurgents had occupied spaces away from the Tsar's control of the public realm. Such underground movements are examples of countercultures which strategically manifest in spaces that are shielded from public surveillance, in opposition to mainstream societal norms or dominant ideologies. From artistic movements to political factions, these communities would continue to activate the backstage spaces of dissent, fueling key oppositional movements in Moscow throughout the 20th century. After the revolution, an extensive propaganda initiative was instituted by the new Soviet state. From the political ideology to creative expression, the ambition was to display communal life as the enlightened future utopia. The Russian avant-garde emerged in this ideological outburst when the aggressive pursuit of the future was fully being embraced by the state. Through radical experimentation, artists, poets, and architects strive to foresee and realize the formal language of this utopia. As the state was broadly rethinking the future of society, the avant-garde was reinventing the everyday in order to achieve it. These ideas took the form of the bold geometries and novel typologies of constructivist architecture during the 1920s and 30s. These buildings were spaces of social and cultural production. The majority were residential, factory, and communal buildings. New building typologies also emerged as spaces for the future society. Thought of as social activators, they were designed around an idealized collective life, enabled by the building itself. Communal houses minimized individual space in favor of shared zones for domestic activities such as cooking, bathing, and dining. And workers' clubs were places for social interaction and cultural production after working hours. As the avant-garde designer Al Lishitsky described, the ultimate role of the club is to liberate men from the oppression of the state. The end of constructivism was signaled by a shift in scale of the architectural interests of the state. Ambitious avant-garde projects were rejected in preference of monumental neoclassical buildings representing power and stability. From this point on, Soviet architecture was transformed from the innovative human-scale constructivist buildings into a demonstration of power and excess, the decadence of the present rather than the pursuit of the future. Historian Vladimir Peperny describes the period of the avant-garde as Culture 1 and the subsequent era of the Soviet Empire as Culture 2. Culture 1 and Culture 2 exist in opposition. One reaches for the future, and the other transforms the future into an eternity, while turning its gaze back on the past. Whereas the avant-garde acted in pursuit of the future, the Soviet Empire slowed progress to stagnation, the future postponed indefinitely. Under Stalin, avant-garde artistic production was restricted and creative labor mandated by the state. From this point on, art, architecture, literature, music, and theater had to conform to official standards that required positive depictions of Soviet life, limiting countercultural expression and dissent. In the post-Stalin Soviet Union, the General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev once again redefined the state architectural agenda. Calling for more efficient construction methods, buildings would be produced as systematically as possible, with minimal new design. Again, the state building standards restricted innovation or forward thinking. During this time, the public realm became a platform for maintaining state loyalty. State-mandated demonstrations involved compulsory parades that glorified the Soviet Union. Public space, the space of state manipulation and control, was active with monocultural demonstrations in favor of the Union and disdainful of anything outside of it. Opposition was a risk to express in public. Amid strong state propaganda and increasing restrictions, alternative forms of counterculture emerged underground. Shared residential spaces, the original spaces of communal living, became hotbeds of political discourse, the spaces of new artistic and social imaginary. Underground art communities avoided state censorship by exhibiting their work in private apartments or at the periphery of the city, away from the surveillance of public space. The private sphere was in many cases strengthened as a result of the swelling and oppressive encroachments of the public sphere. The kitchen table became a backstage social space for successive generations of the intelligentsia. Artistic forms of dissent thrived behind closed doors. These acts not only demonstrated an oppositional ideology, but also opened up spaces of exception for progressive discourse, despite the harsh political context. Avoiding the state-controlled public realm, they inhabited the spaces of communal domestic life that the constructivist architects had envisioned. The decay of these buildings underscores a fading notion that the built environment can become an enabler of progressive forms of political, social, and cultural action in the private realm. In 2012 and 13, Moscow witnessed the largest public demonstration since the end of the Soviet Union in mass protests against the government's manipulation of the 2012 presidential election. Despite the impressiveness of these events, they led to new restrictions against public expression, signaling a decline in personal freedom. What is and is not allowed in public has again become increasingly ambiguous. Significant political movements are fueled by the underground countercultures that critically engage resistance in the production of alternative futures. After all, communities bond in their respective forms of protest against mainstream society. That this critique is channeled through the private realm highlights the significance of these spaces. At the building scale, constructivism's communal buildings are the spatial equivalent of a rational conversation between an unshared private thought and a public outburst of anger. Moscow's history of protest has shown that social action manifests in two spheres, the back and front stage social spaces of society. While the front stage is perhaps more visible, the backstage is the space of cultural imagination, where alternative futures emerge. Today, as dissent manifests in isolated bedrooms connected by social media platforms and Zoom meetings, a reimagination of community spaces is as necessary as ever, as the ability to shift from backstage to front stage is more immediate and perhaps more volatile than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsey, and thank you all for those presentations and for your articles. It's been really nice to revisit them. I think it's been almost over 1.5 years since Mason and I edited those articles, and there's just still so much I'm digging into and gathering from these pieces and some of the design projects. I'm just going to kick off the kind of discussion part, and again, if anyone in the audience has any questions, please use the Q&A forum. We'll be gathering from there in the next 20-30 minutes, so feel free to probe any of our presenters or to piggyback on any of the conversation that ensues. It's interesting with the curation of the 4 of you, I never saw this kind of overlap, but it seems like there's the metaphor of the archipelago in some ways cuts through all of these presentations, obviously most overtly in Azadeh's presentation with the reference to Unger's project, but Case, your reference to MOOF and the kind of conflictual consensus in some ways is, is very closely tied to that Unger's idea of the archipelago allowing for the autonomy of pieces, but being connected together into an overall kind of field. Chris, I think you're yearning for, I think showing these parklets and talking about tactical urbanism and asking how does it scale up is in some ways of saying, how do the pieces of an archipelago come together to be more than the sum of their parts? And I think that would also apply, Lindsey, to your study on these kind of interiors that by nature, because they were hidden from the public realm and in the backstage, often disconnected and invisible. So that, social media, as you mentioned at the very end here, acts as one way to connect or bring those together. But I was hoping that you all could reflect a little bit on how in the metaphor of the archipelago, what that collective medium is that pulls that conversation together. And I'm talking here spatially on one hand for some of you, but also politically, Case, in your case, and Case, you can also use spatial references as well if that's easier, but what is that kind of central medium by which those things become bigger than the sum of their parts? And Chris, I'm looking to you a little bit because you showed some kind of zoomed out things, but you didn't refer to them specifically. And so you showed like very small things, and then you showed kind of zoomed out things. And there was the implication there that there was some sort of feedback and mechanism between these scales. And I guess, larger questions that you posed as well, which I think are also important to unpack, of just how do you scale up, when this device?
I'm there's something about, I also see this crosscut of the archipelago and the part to whole, I think, question. And somehow there's a significance to the need to unplug the part, to at least temporarily, like that act of drawing a boundary in a discrete boundary, whether it's, between front stage and backstage, or, the individual dwelling unit and the whole urban mass, or, kind of archipelagic, islands in the city. That act of unplugging allows for at least a temporary freedom of imagination and projection, I think. And I think that's what's critical to this idea of, connecting part to whole, and of taking the seemingly individual or interior and scaling it to the level that it can then go back and act on those systems and structures from which you've unplugged it. So I think, I know I flashed a few projects, from Atelier Bow Wow.
Does it presuppose a whole exists? Like in some ways that archipelago metaphor could be speculative, right? And so, because I think in some of the examples, like the parklet, for instance, there's no whole per se of that initiative. Is that something that, I know that whole doesn't exist in our current politics, but let's say that there was some sort of conception of how those little parklets amass to something more than the individuality of the street corners that they're on. Do you see that, you know, shifting their effectiveness or actually being something that could have more agency?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point of the parklet was to reframe the whole of the space of the street in the entire city, you know, and make us aware that that is an immense territory that is connected and that is some sort of a totality in a sense. And the kind of reframing of that through a piece and saying, actually, this is public space. You know, it's on loan to cars. Was a way of creating the awareness of the whole, you know, from the park.
I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in. Case, go for it.
Oh, Case is muted. I think he has to unmute himself.
Can Case be unmuted, please?
Yeah, I was
There we
trying
go.
to unmute myself, but I was not given the power to do so, but now it's, so, yeah, I mean, I think it was fascinating series of discussions. I think one of the things what was interesting about Move is this idea, and maybe in the sense of an archipelago, I think that in researching this paper, if you can see the ocean as kind of the field of design, there's like the archipelagos are kind of the small islands of, I think, us practicing in design that are actually engaging the political. And I think somehow we have to come together to kind of make that voice much stronger. The other thing which is kind of interesting in Move's conception is that it's not so much, you know, about being enemies, but it's about being adversaries. So it's about, we can disagree, but as long as we kind of engage the political realm. And I think that's something that I've been seeing over the past couple of months on Twitter. I think, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about safe streets and safe for whom and who's included. And I think all those discussions are very good because we don't necessarily have to all agree of like why we should design a street a specific way, as long as we understand that there's political intentions and it engages the political realm when we're thinking about these decisions. And I think those are the things that I was kind of grappling with and understanding in Hester, talking about kind of the very small group of us that are actually engaging with kind of political decision making or political choices in the way that we frame our design decisions. Most of us, I think this is the challenge. I think it's a fair question to ask for a service-oriented industry that we are. Can we, like, how much agency do we have to kind of go against the clients that we, you know, that we have? We can choose not to have to work for those clients, but we might lose our job. So what do we do then? And these are, I think, hard questions, and they might also kind of then get to the question of like, how can we scale this up? It's relatively easy to do as a counter to kind of larger public discourse and do it as a parklet, but how do you do this how do you scale it up? And yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answers. I think it's that's why we have very few, I think, examples of those, but I think it's a critical discussion that we need to have.
I mean, I feel like you all spoke also to interventions not necessarily being about objecthood, but being about process. I feel like all of you were actually really speaking primarily to the intervention or the concept of reaction occurring not as embodied in the end result. Like, yes, we saw some design proposals and we saw examples, the Blue House or Azadeh, the intervention in the commercial space as propositions. But I feel like in some ways they were the net result of a process that itself questioned maybe some of the hierarchies there that you were speaking to, Case. And I quite like how you brought up Randy Hester's five practitioner types, or 5 types of practitioners. I love this idea of the blissfully naive to the catalyst. Maybe what I'm thinking about in listening to these wonderful presentations and seeing them in a new light as when Niraj and I originally encountered them and considering them for the publication is thinking about the role of expertise here and thinking, is like coming at this issue not around what objects or what types do we produce so much as in what way are we fostering new roles for designers? Has the kind of hierarchy or has the tendency to assume a patron, or certainly we know the economics and the sort of financing behind architecture is complicit within that hierarchy. But, and this is where citizen action, I feel like citizens are actually teaching us or demonstrating new expertise to design professionals more than the design professions, right? Like, and I think, Chris, you spoke to it through the Rebar project. And I don't know, maybe I wonder if maybe Azadeh and Lindsey, since you haven't had a chance to join the conversation, maybe more pointed conversations to you. Do you think that your presentations, your papers are questioning the architect's assumption of expertise and even acting in these realms? Or is this something that's part of maybe the language or some of the arc of your thinking? I feel like there was a lot about sort of learning and listening from cultural movements. This seemed to be a primary act.
Thank you, Mason. Just to go back a little bit in response to Niraj's question on archipelago, ending up with your comments. I think my approach and my take for this project was a strategy to stay against the domino effect, that if one space falls, the rest can survive. And this is how I pretty much felt that this city island or the introduction of archipelago as a strategy suits the proposal quite well, especially that it was in relationship to tactical approaches as compared to a holistic approach with which we can consider it as an imposed strategy. Having said that, since I'm proposing borrowing ideas from the everyday act, the everyday rituals, everyday spaces of being and living, I would say as architects within design discipline, yes, I would feel responsible to kind of create this bridge between this everydayness and the practice of architecture as a discipline. For example, by focusing on this idea of the symbiosis of commerce and community, there exists a group of people who are involved with the money-making process, and there stays a group of people who are involved with using these products. And there is this gap in between that needs to be filled by, I would say, designers of how to come up with proposals to kind of stitch together the demands and needs of the two parties. I personally don't think all the shop makers or shopping mall designers are evil people. They want to make money, but how do they know to kind of factor in the concept of everyday life, or the concept of revival of cultural activists or civic presence within their commercial entities? These are the gaps and laps that can be filled with the agency of architects and designers, indeed. Lindsey?
Yeah, I have thoughts on both questions as well. Something that struck me about the projects that were shown and sort of my research about countercultural activities in the private realm is the kind of theme of reappropriation. In the case of these underground movements, the kind of most agile political spaces were actually, you know, the kind of private interiors, which were easier to sort of co-opt than the public realm. And I think, you know, we've seen many examples of how that is true. And so that becomes, I think, a sort of kind of design reference or a kind of process that designers can learn from, right? But I also think that it was part of some of the intentions of the kind of original constructivist designs that I mentioned. To talk a little bit about the archipelago question, in the book that I mentioned at the beginning, Nandini Bagshi's book about counter-institutions in New York City, she references Michel Foucault's mention of the swarm of points of resistance in the history of sexuality. And that concept is that sort of resistance and opposition lives within inside of a power structure, and it operates as a swarm of points, right? So these discrete individual actions, let's say, that collectively have power, but they are kind of distinct from each other. So unlike the network or you know, these kind of larger structures, that their agility is in their independence. And the small scale spaces that I've looked at in this chapter are spaces of organizing, right? Are spaces of strategizing. And without, I think it was mentioned earlier, without that kind of ability to disconnect, to focus, to kind of shift a scale of discourse or action, the kind of large kind of connected body of a political movement loses its kind of strategic power. So I think it's kind of interesting to see the kind of effectiveness of the archipelago's disparate parts.
Maybe piggybacking off of that, I'm glad you brought up this conversation around power and questions of consolidated versus distributed forms of power. And, you know, just thinking about some of us are coming live from the United States, where, you know, we are the laughingstock of the globe in terms of a response to the pandemic. And we've seen actually certain countries be able to really flatten their curve and have a downward trend, where a lot of consolidated and centralized power has led to measures that would otherwise be seen as impinging on one's individual freedoms and rights in the American context and in many other countries around the world. And I know these articles are actually kind of cited within different geographies where there's from more consolidated to less consolidated forms of power. I think Azadeh, your and Lindsey's articles are obviously working within power structures that are trying to dismantle them, where there's not as much freedom to express that form of distributed power. I guess I'm just curious, with, you know, the calamities on the horizon, whether we speak of climate change, you know, and other things that we know have a timeliness to them, and within this conversation of power, which I think everyone in some ways is advocating for distributed forms of power, because this is really power with the people. Can we address some of the problems we need to address in the next 20 to 100 years by distributing that power? And I don't know the answer. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this, because I think there's, I would love to say yes, but of course, when I watch the news and see people that refuse to wear masks, I really wonder about the ultra freedom of distributing power and the lack of any form of regulation on one's individual, you know, rights.
Wasn't sure if you were going to say 20 to 100 years or 20 to 100 days.
Yeah.
It could be either at this point. The time is becoming less and less relevant, I guess.
I mean, maybe another, this is gonna be a tough one, Niraj, you're throwing a big one in there. What can we do in 20 years? I mean, I think what's quite interesting, and I mean, for me, I was kind of struck, Chris, you actually kind of surprised me with your presentation. I enjoyed the kind of criticality by which you looked at what actions can do and what they can do for the city. And maybe I wanted to ask you a slightly more personal question. whether you see this as a slight disillusionment from the moment at which you wrote it to the moment at which the book came out. I mean, I think we also, I mean, there was some time in there, which is certainly on Niraj and I, but I wonder if your pro-action, your sort of provocation of this idea of pro-action is slightly almost a kind of, I don't know, agonistic term in and of itself, of sort of finding a space between antagonizing and sort of tacit agreement with it. Do you see pro-action as a sort of inhabitable middle space between full action and decided inaction? Are you trying to carve out a space here for possibility?
I'm always trying to carve out space for possibility. Yeah, you know, it's interesting I was going to bring up agonism as well, because even just reading everybody's articles, I saw a kind of common thread there in the idea. I mean, Case, you were explicit about it, but I think, you know, it's implicit in some of the other writing, and I think, you know, Mason, you definitely touched on my own struggle, I think, with, you know, situating myself as an architect in you know, both the realm of practice, but also in the world, and in the compelling urgency to act. And I think that's why, you know, I mean, I kind of came up with pro-action, you know, yesterday. So I can't say that it's a fully formulated thesis yet, but I think, you know, and Niraj will know this, you know, these questions always come back to questions of agency for me, you know, and you know, the introspection in, you know, in looking at these actions, you know, but also understanding their limitations, you know, and as I said in my presentation today, and I you know, I think was in the article, and maybe the tone has changed a little bit, but you know, I'm genuinely interested in them, but I'm also highly critical, and I feel a deep need to understand where architecture and architectural practice resides, you know, in that in-between somehow, between, inevitably we are connected, you know, architectural practice is embedded in and implicated in the state and in capitalism and in, you know, these superstructures that we rely on to, you know, for the material practice, you know, for bringing, you know, people, labor and materials together in space to produce architecture. And I think that's very powerful as a place to practice. But at the same time, the fear is that are we doomed to just reify those systems and structures, or, you know, can we, you know, temporarily break free from them, you know, in our, either through the act of production or through the object itself, find ways to resist or find ways to create counter proposals that then act back on those systems and structures. That's the fundamental question for me.
Maybe Lindsey, Azadeh, Case, we'll move to some questions in the Q&A very soon. I don't know if you want to build on Chris's comments or any of the ongoing discussion before we open it up to the Q&A group.
I was just going to add, you know, speaking about the kind of urgency and kind of the very large and very small scales of actions that are necessary right now. You know, in New York City, at least for me, I've spent the past few months kind of working on very small scale interventions, helping restaurants build out their, you know, curb lane seating areas or kind of proposals for kind of streetscape interventions. And again, to bring up a word that I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of very interested by the kind of agility to reappropriate spaces like the parking lane or at a much larger scale, you know, the Javits Center into a field hospital. And these spaces, which in my work I refer to as spaces of exception, they exist at multiple scales, and they, you know, kind of have some degree of slipperiness when whether by their scale or by their typology or by their complex legislation, they have the ability to, when necessary, be sort of co-opted. And I'm curious whether the architect can be strategic about how, you know, spaces of exception can sort of be introduced or into the built environment. So I was kind of speculating during this research that maybe constructivists somehow had a bit of that intention, right? The home would be the space of this kind of future society. And so by rethinking the act of everyday life, you're somehow kind of creating a space for that kind of agility. And so, you know, if you look at the building I showed the decaying photograph of today in Moscow, it's now been renovated into luxury apartments. And, you know, that after such a long history of being a space of sort of communal life and counterculture is an act of just affirming the kind of dominant culture and sort of, you know, real estate market. And, you know, I think perhaps what we're all kind of looking for, but maybe can strategically insert into some of our work are these kind of opportunities for spaces of exception, those spaces that could be co-opted or converted in the future.
Just to echo on Lindsey's comment, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that actions happen with or without architects. It doesn't matter, it happens. And I think I'm glad that I had the chance to include Tehran as a case study in this whole panel discussion, because like Tehran, like many other similar cities, has shown that with or without designers or architects, actions become a point of survival, not just making and shaping the city or the built environment, but simply an act of survival. I think what matters the most is, as Lindsey said, to strategize this happening that nobody can stop, to make it fruitful and to guide it towards a desirable ending. I think that is where the role of an architect or the design field comes the most important.
Okay, I think we're going to shift. We're got a few minutes left here. Niraj, you want to pick a question from the Q&A session, and then I'll look for one as well.
And I'll pose this to any of our presenters. I'm going to grab from Kristen Hughes' question. People design without designers regardless every day. I'm hearing that maybe the role of the architect / designer is more of the role of the organizer. So it's about connecting these designs, these peoples, these communities behind them, and forming a web of relations. Thoughts on this, the role of the designer as an organizer?
Is that pro-action enough for you, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's totally, I mean, I can see that. And I think, I mean, I think it's this fine balance, because I thought it was interesting to see Azadeh's proposal of, in the end, like these thoughts and these organizations need to come together in a kind of a proposition of a spatial formation, whether it's through objects or what else. But I do think there is a lack of engagement with communities and kind of understanding who are the kind of actors and constituents that we're designing for. So I think we have a tendency to kind of get bubbled, another word that we're hearing a lot, but kind of get siloed in our thinking and get so focused on the material and the space that we're creating that we're forgetting about who is participating in, you know, the kind of, let's say, the extraction of the materials to how it becomes the material that you're working with, from the different people that are either enabled or disabled from being engaged with these spaces through accessibility or the context within which is something is located. So I do think it's a both. I do think that we've traditionally probably focused much more on the design of objects and forms, and that we have, you know, we're seeing a shift in kind of understanding who are we designing for and who are we designing with, and kind of understanding, building up that network of collaborators. And I think it, you know, maybe links a little bit to Gary's question about, you know, who are the developers, who are like, who are we being hired through, and how can we influence them, but also how can we identify other publics that we can serve through the design that maybe the client hasn't identified as one of their target audiences, so to speak.
Great, thanks. Maybe another question from the Q&A group. How about the one from Cesar Escalante, who's asking, his comment is that the most agile cultural discussions are now shaped within digital social media spaces. Is there any role for architecture and the architect to counteract the loss of physical interaction? Isn't this an existential threat to the future of common spaces as we know it? I don't know if anyone would like to have some thoughts or response on that question.
Yes, it is an existential threat.
I don't know. You know, I was struck in kind of going back to this article and the work at, you know, the parallels to today in the US, you know, conducting the research as an American in Moscow in 2012 was very different than it is to see the parallels to what's happening here in our country. But also the parallels to kind of the incredible activation of the private realm in the past few months, and how that has actually directly caused some extremely kind of important and radical outbursts into the public realm. So I don't know, in some ways, and social media, I think is, you know, operating between those, right? It depends on kind of the scale of audience, and it's sort of flickering between the back and front stage all the time. But it does seem to give another mechanism of what we've been talking about, strategizing and organizing. And, you know, maybe to be optimistic about it, there's an opportunity that sort of, that kind of detachment from the public realm is a bit like what we said is the power of the archipelago, that it's a moment to kind of think strategically and thoughtfully about how to activate the public realm. You know, we wouldn't have rethought parking spaces the way we are currently without, you know, that complete absence of using public space for a couple of months under COVID. So in that way, potentially can be beneficial.
No, I'm sorry to make a cheeky response to that. Lindsey, I agree. I mean, and I'm thinking about your piece and you know, the statement from Nandini, I forgot her last name, but
Actually,
you know, that, you know, space is not a neutral actor in this. You know, while it may seem that everything is happening virtually, space is an enabler, and the production of culture that that we've seen happen, under COVID and coming out of people's, homes versus coming out of, cultural institutions that traditionally house them is, is revolutionary in some ways. And the social media is a medium. So it is really just another way for, maybe we think of it as our version of samizdat, right? That it's the way that the flock, the swarm actually becomes a swarm, right? It's a way that the organization, the self-organization occurs. And so in that sense, architecture's role maybe shifts, and the need for formal spaces of organization, evolves, or it is not as necessary. And these informal spaces, i.e. the domestic sphere, become the space of organization up to a point. And then, as Lindsey, as you said, it spills out into the public realm, and that the poignancy of that spill out, the risks people take to actually go out in the street and express dissent is even more apparent somehow. So I don't know if that answers the question. I see that connection, and I see the connection to kind of to the last question too. Lindsey, your and Azadeh's projects in a way are related in the sense of, the architect as the organizer of spaces in which that counterculture is produced. On the one hand, the constructivists did not necessarily intend that, but those spaces were reappropriated. And Azadeh, it seems like you're reappropriating spaces meant for capitalist consumption into spaces of countercultural production. So, the architect's ability to intervene in that reappropriation and potentially to see how those individual spaces are connected to a larger system or set of systems, I think is important.
Yes, thank you for your comment. Also to, again, echo on what you just said and what Lindsey said, architect as organizers, this COVID experience was a brilliant, I would say, experience to kind of highlight this role more and more, especially that we learned that the public realm can easily move from this whole concept of bigness, something that we were dealing with much earlier, into the scale of smallness. And this is a huge shift in all levels, historically, theoretically, and even design-wise. And it's lacking perhaps a mediator. Again, I'm not entirely sure, because many managed quite well during COVID to kind of come up with a variety of brilliant solutions. And well, I've seen a lot, many people around me, non-architects who managed to do that. But again, I think this shift that we witnessed in past few months highlights the role of the architect as an organizer even further. And perhaps it's one of those revolutionary moments that we need to pause and think further about how to redefine this discipline.
Maybe we should leave it here. I don't know if there's any closing comments. Case, you wanted maybe a closing comment, or are we at a good wrap up point?
I thought it was pretty good. I mean, I thought
Okay.
that we left it there kind of
I couldn't tell if you
optimistically
were.
and kind of open-ended. So
Yeah.
I
I
don't
mean,
want
this
to
is
destroy that.
absolutely. This is like the dilemma of Zoom etiquette. Like, are you about to speak or are you about not to? But yeah, this was amazing. I think first session for us. Niraj and I are hosting another one on October 7th, also at 4 p.m. EST, 1 p.m. PST. So we'll put out some more information on the guests for that event within the coming week or two. To register for any of the Daniels events, go and see the Daniels website where you can see some of the links there. Same thing with CCA events. You can go to the CCA portal page. Niraj, you want to announce the next event at CCA?
Yeah, we just launched a website called scaffold.architecture.cca.edu, which has all the fall events. The next event will be a book launch and symposium on race and modern architecture, critical history from the Enlightenment to present, with Irene Chang, faculty at CCA, and several of the contributors to the book. That will be this Friday, September 18th at 12 p.m. Pacific time. And I believe the next Daniels event is part of the Daniels series, talk series called Strange Primitivism and Other Things, and it's coming up on Thursday, September 24th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. So please check out those sites and register for those events. And thank you all so much to our presenters today for sharing your work and your patience as we brought together these ideas in the book.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, Case, Lindsey, and Azadeh. And thanks to Daniels and CCA team behind the scenes. And thanks to the audience for dropping in today. Really enjoyed it. Everyone get outside and take some pro-action in your walking around out there.
Thanks, Mason and Niraj. It's been really great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mason, Niraj, for the opportunity.
Yeah, great to see everyone. Take care. We'll talk soon.
Stay
Bye.
safe, stay
Talk
healthy.
soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.